to know a secret?
Do you want 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 to know a secret? Every day around the world, all of us use secret codes, and we don't even realize it.
There's always been a battle between people who want to keep secrets and people who want to get those secrets.
It's a battle that's raged for centuries as codes have been cracked and history changed forever. This queen loses her head when her enemies intercept and decode her conspiracy messages.
And Mary, Queen of Scots, was convinced that her codes wouldn't be broken.
The interception of this coded telegram sent by Arthur Zimmerman forces America into the First World War.
The solution of the Zimmerman telegram changed the entire history of the 20th century.
The Zodiac Killer continues stalking the streets of San Francisco and murders again. Because his coded messages can't be cracked.
If you're trying to solve a message from a killer, you will guess at what possible words might be in there. Well, kill might be one, victim might be another.
This is the story of the continuing battle between code makers and code breakers, and how their fight shaped our world. Code makers have always gone to extraordinary lengths to keep their secret coded messages secret. In 1587, a future Queen of England loses her head thinking this code unbreakable. The key players in this Elizabethan tragedy are Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Catholic English nobleman Anthony Babington, spy master Sir Francis Walsingham, and a mysterious genius called Thomas Phelps.
Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Queen of Scotland, but had had to flee the country and come to England, where she was theoretically a guest of Queen Elizabeth I of England. But the English government had real problems with this because England was a Protestant nation and the Queen was Protestant, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic, and she was next in line to the throne if Elizabeth didn't have any children. So she was naturally the centre of any conspiracy to get rid of Elizabeth and replace the Protestant Queen with a new Catholic Queen.
Under lock and key, with her every move carefully watched, Mary must think of even more secret and devious ways of communicating with her Catholic allies in London, France, and Spain.
She decides to use a series of ciphers to communicate secretly with people, which even if they are intercepted, then she assumes nobody will be able to read them because they're all in code.
In June 1586, Mary begins corresponding with Catholic conspirator Anthony Babington.
The method that Babington and Mary, Queen of Scots, decide upon to get the letters between each other is to use the services of the brewer who delivers beer to Mary's household once a week. So she would write a letter which her secretaries would then encode, and once that she had the coded letter, it was rolled up very small. And then what they'd done is hollow out the bung inside the beer barrels so the letter could be placed inside the bung put back in the barrel, and then the brewer would drive out with the barrels, take the letter out and have it delivered to Babington in London.
Mary writes her secret letters using what's known as a nomenclator. This cipher uses individual symbols to correspond to individual letters. To hasten the writing of a long letter, commonly used words and phrases such as how, why, and when are given their own symbol. Codes can be as simple or as complex as you want them to be. It's just a matter of choosing the right tool for the job. So how do you know which type of code to use? One man who knows the answer is David Kahn, an expert on keeping secrets. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Code Breakers, and widely regarded as the world's leading expert on the history of codes and cryptology.
For centuries, when you used a cipher, you had to have a key to encipher the message. The person who wanted to unlock that message had to have the exact same key so that he was able to unlock the message.
Over 2,000 years ago, Roman Emperor Julius Caesar realizes that keeping the key to his ciphers a secret is of great military importance. So he creates one of the first ever recorded ciphers to pass secret information onto his generals.
When Julius Caesar wanted to put a letter into cipher, he slid each letter 4 places to the left so that A became D, B became E, and so forth.
But Caesar's shift cipher is easily broken. Once you determine that the key is a shift of 4 letters, you crack the entire message. To solve Mary Queen of Scots' cipher requires far more ingenuity.
Mary was fairly convinced that her codes wouldn't be broken. She was very careful to regularly change them to create new alphabets. She inserted nulls, which are symbols that don't mean anything, throughout her codes to try and prevent them being broken. But she's unaware at the time that the English state, and particularly Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State, has employed a man called Thomas Phillips, who's a brilliant cryptographer, who has what to the English is a new method of actually cracking these codes.
It's known as frequency analysis and works by studying how commonly used letters appear when enciphered. So when Babington's name is encrypted using Mary's cipher, it's easy to spot the repeated letters. Spy master Sir Francis Walsingham and his mysterious cryptographer, Thomas Phillips, whose portrait doesn't exist, immediately begin cracking all of Mary's codes. They're looking for a single piece of treasonous evidence to prove Mary is plotting with the Catholics to overthrow Queen Elizabeth.
Mary Queen of Scots receives a letter from Babington in which he explains that he intends to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. Her secretaries warn her not to reply to it because she might incriminate herself if the letter's ever intercepted. But she does anyway, and she suggests ways in which she might be broken out of her prison and what would then happen to make her Queen of England.
Mary's reply to Babington's assassination letter is immediately intercepted by Thomas Phillips before it can be smuggled out of the prison.
He decodes it and realizes that in this letter he has exactly the evidence of treason that they need to finally execute Mary. And he does 2 extraordinary things. He writes a postscript on the letter. He forges some extra lines on the bottom of the letter, pretending that Mary is asking for the names of the people who are actually going to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. He then folds the letter up, and on the outside he draws a gallows because he knows that this is the letter that will finally incriminate her and bring her to her death.
Queen Elizabeth can't ignore her cousin's Catholic plotting. Mary, Queen of Scots, is beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587 in front of 300 witnesses. The symbols Mary uses in her cipher bear an uncanny resemblance to those written by a serial killer stalking San Francisco almost 400 years later. But this cipher has an added complexity. Each symbol has many different meanings. Can the code be cracked before the killer strikes again? Between 1968 and 1973, a lone killer preys on young people in the San Francisco Bay Area. 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Mike Mago sit parked near a golf course. It's almost midnight on Friday, the 4th of July, 1969. A car approaches and flashes its lights. The couple get their IDs ready, thinking it's the police.
What?
He fires 9 shots, The young man survives, but the girl dies. A reign of terror begins. Over the next 6 years, the killer commits at least 5 known murders, though he himself claims 7. Some experts put the figure as high as 37. He is never caught. Nearly a month after the murder, he sends 3 coded messages to 3 local newspapers, demanding they be published. He threatens that if the codes aren't printed, he'll go on a kill rampage. But if the codes are cracked, they'll reveal his identity. Within days of sending his coded messages, he writes again, this time calling himself Zodiac.
The Zodiac killer used what's called a homophonic cipher. This means that each letter of the original message could be replaced by 1 or 2 or 3 different symbols. So if the most frequent letter in the English language, E, is replaced not by just X, but by X, Q, and R, that will make it more difficult to solve.
Using a homophonic cipher means the killer is aware of letter frequency analysis and seeks to disguise any repeated letters in his messages. He chooses a group of symbols he likes, allocates them to represent letters of the alphabet, and cycles them so that the same symbol doesn't repeat. It was a race against time to crack the Zodiac's code. The FBI, CIA, NSA, and Naval Intelligence all begin work on the cipher. But it's a school teacher and his wife in Salinas, California, armed only with pen and paper, that crack the killer's code. Donald Hardin calculates that the killer's ego would demand the message would include the letter I. He also knows that one of the most commonly used double letters is L.
If you're trying to solve a message from a killer, you will guess at what possible words might be in there. Well, kill might be one, police might be another, escape might be another, victim might be another.
Using a homophonic cipher relies on the writer to correctly cycle the symbols to avoid repeating the same combination of symbols for double letters. This is where Hardin and his wife get lucky. The killer gets bored or sloppy writing his message, and as Hardin predicts, the first word they crack contains the double letter L, kill. It takes the Hardins 6 days to decipher the entire message, beating all of the other government agencies. But California's jubilation is short-lived. The message just taunts the police and doesn't reveal the killer's identity. To make matters worse, the killer sends another coded message that can't be cracked using the Hardin's key. The so-called 340 cipher, named after the amount of characters it contains, has never been solved. 40 years later, this symbolic processing class at the University of North Texas is attempting to decode the 340-character cipher. Professor Ryan Garlick is determined to crack the Zodiac code, but the numbers are stacked against him.
The Zodiac 340 cipher contains 63 unique symbols, and so if we say that there can be 26 letters represented by each symbol, then that gives us 26 to the 63rd possible keys to this cipher. And that's a 90-digit number, which means that even if we put a powerful computer or a group of computers to work on the problem, then we still can't run through all the possible combinations.
He thinks one way to try and solve it is to create computer shortcuts.
Well, the software that we developed at the University of North Texas uses a genetic algorithm which takes sort of candidate keys and has a mapping of the symbol in the cipher to an English letter. And we will generate those keys randomly.
The computer program runs in 3 parts. First, it converts each symbol of the original Zodiac message into a text that a computer can read. Then, the software guesses the English letter each symbol might correspond to. Finally, Based on that guess, it tries to make English words out of the letters that the program produces.
Then we come in and score each key and say, well, this key produces a solution that looks English-like. So we then take a top portion of our potential solutions and say, oh, let's take half of this good solution and combine it with the other half of another good solution and see if the child of those two potential solutions is any better.
The constant combining of the keys from the good solutions often create more English words. But as of now, none have provided a complete solution with meaningful sentences. After many thousands of hours of calculation, the code still hasn't been cracked. The identity of the Zodiac Killer remains a mystery. But how did one man, back in the 1960s, come up with an unbreakable code in the first place?
He may have used some books that were available at the time. So, if chapter 1 of that book is homophonic substitution ciphers, and we know that that's how the first solved cipher was encoded, then we definitely want to look at chapter 2 in that book to see how this one might be decoded.
One of the few books publicly available about codes back in the 1960s was written by none other than David Kahn.
I'd like to think it's a viable theory that he may have learned about codes from the code breakers. I'm not happy that it was used to help a killer.
Books are the keys to creating and cracking many codes, a piece of text that both the sender and the receiver each have access to. One of the most well-known and mysterious codes is based on one of the most famous documents. If you can crack the Beale ciphers, they'll lead you to the location of buried treasure, gold, silver, and jewels worth an estimated $36 million. The location of the treasure is encrypted somewhere in the words of the Declaration of Independence. These are the Beale ciphers, potentially the most valuable coded messages in the world.
The Beale ciphers are a series of encrypted messages which seem to indicate the location of a buried treasure.
The origin of the Beale ciphers is shrouded in mystery. The story begins here in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Between 1819 and 1821, Mr. Thomas Jefferson Beale and a group of friends allegedly buried 2 loads of treasure somewhere within a 4-mile radius of the town Buford's Tavern. The quantity of treasure is enormous: 2,900 pounds of gold, 5,100 pounds of silver, and $13,000 worth of jewels. Beale carefully notes the secret location and sets about making sure that no one can find it. He enciphers his secret in 3 separate parts and gives it to the owner of a local hotel. Mr. Beale then completely disappears, forever. The first coded message tells the location of the buried gold, silver, and jewels. The second, the quantity of the treasure. And the third, a list of names to whom the treasure rightfully belongs. By the 1860s, the ciphers are in the possession of a mysterious, unnamed author who sets about cracking them. He guesses the codes based on a printed text. But which text? He claims he tries every book he can lay his hands on before the Declaration of Independence gives him the clue he's looking for. He starts by numbering the words of the Declaration so that when becomes 1, in becomes 2, the 3, course 4, of 5, human 6, and so on. Then he painstakingly finds the words in the Declaration that match the numbers of the Beale ciphers and finally cracks the code. Unfortunately, this method only deciphers one of the 3 messages, the cipher telling the quantity of treasure. The other 2, naming the shareholders and the treasure's location, remain unbroken. Almost 150 years later.
My own conclusion is that it's some kind of a hoax. Somebody has made up a phony secret message to drive 1 million amateur code breakers crazy in the hope of finding this treasure somewhere down near Roanoke, Virginia.
Codes based on a printed text eventually fall out of fashion. But homemade, handwritten code books, the stuff of spy movies, are essential in a time before computers, especially in times of war, when capturing an enemy's codes meant the difference between life or death. For the first 3 years of World War I, British and German armies slaughter each other in the mud of northern France. By 1917, Britain is desperate for help from the United States. Germany is equally desperate that America doesn't join the war. The interception and decoding of this single encrypted message is a major factor in forcing President Woodrow Wilson to declare war on Germany. In the days before computers and the World Wide Web, communicating with the world is a much slower and potentially dangerous business.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the world is connected together by telegraph. Cables have been physically laid between countries, right across the Atlantic, across the Mediterranean to North Africa, and those are the lines of communication. There is a web across the world of these physical cables across land and under the sea, which enable countries to communicate with each other.
But just like its modern counterpart, this telegraph network is open to hackers. In this case, the British government has been listening in on all German messages crossing the Atlantic since 1914. And this is where the messages end up, Whitehall in London. In 1917, this is the most secret place in Britain, a nerve center of military espionage and code breaking known as Room 40. Even though the British capture several German code books early in the war, the Germans are constantly changing them. They're using a series of very large code books containing 10,000 words and phrases numbered from 0 to 9,999. Then they encrypt them again by adding extra digits, the so-called double-decker super encipherment. Many of the German messages are routine communications between trenches and the front line concerning troop movements and supplies. But occasionally there are diplomatic messages between German embassies around Europe. These are encrypted using the diplomatic code 0075, which the British have only recently discovered and not yet fully cracked. So when a coded telegram sent from Berlin to the German minister in Mexico is intercepted in January 1917, it's a race to decode it.
It's often essential when you're solving a code to try to guess the words. You're faced with a blank bunch of numbers. What do they mean? However, they don't exist in a vacuum. People have sent diplomatic telegrams for a long time, and diplomatic telegrams often begin with, "I have the honor to inform Your Excellency." So if you have seen this in plain text, you can guess that that may be the beginning formula in code text.
The first thing the code breakers of Room 40 do is start looking for numbers that make up the word stop, the telegraphic method of ending sentences. They then decrypt a very high number at the end of the message, the signature of Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary. They then spot strange combinations of numbers that decode into letters which don't make sense by themselves. AR, IZ, ON, A, or Arizona, a word not listed in the 10,000-word German code book. So it's been made up phonetically. When they decrypt a number of high code groups in the message, they conclude that these make up the words Texas and New Mexico. As they crack the code, the significance of the message becomes clear. Germany is proposing to support Mexico if they invade the U.S. As a reward, Mexico will regain control of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This is not only a deliberate act of aggression on Germany's part, it's also a diversionary tactic. If the U.S. is busy fighting its neighbor, it won't get involved in the war in Europe. When faced with the evidence of the Zimmerman telegram, President Woodrow Wilson has no option. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. "19 months later, World War I is won, due in no small part to the interception and decoding of the Zimmerman telegram.
The solution of the Zimmerman telegram, probably the most important cryptogram solution of all time, brought the United States into the war, brought the United States onto the world stage, and in effect changed the entire history of the 20th century.
The Germans don't discover the Allies have cracked their codes until near the end of the war, and that their plans for Mexico were doomed to failure from the start.
The Zimmerman telegram was a ludicrous idea, really. Mexico was never going to declare war on the United States. All of the armaments factories in the Americas were in the United States, and Germany could never supply Mexico because the Atlantic was controlled by the British Royal Navy, so they'd never get any arms or men over there in the first place. And Mexico finally didn't want back the three states it had lost. They were now largely English-speaking. Mexico was Spanish-speaking. They didn't believe they'd be able to hold on to them even if they got them, so they refused.
But the Zimmerman telegram might not have been cracked if the Germans had been using a 500-year-old device known as the Alberti code disk. Its secret, wheels within wheels that can scramble alphabets so completely they're virtually unreadable. Around 1470, it's the invention made by this man, Leon Battista Alberti, that changes cryptology forever.
Alberti is one of the great forgotten men of the Renaissance. He was a great scientist, but particularly he was interested in codes and ciphers. And at the center of this world is the papacy. Alberti had a friend who was one of the Pope's secretaries, and he set him the challenge of creating a method of coding documents. And what Alberti came up with is perhaps the first ciphering device in history, which is the cipher wheel.
It was a cipher disk which produced the first form of polyalphabetic substitution, called polyalphabetic because as this turned, it produced different cipher alphabets.
Each of the two rotating disks contain the 24 letters of the Latin alphabet. The inner disk's letters are in random order. Alberti's encryption process relies on both sender and receiver possessing identical disks and having previously agreed on an index or key letter on the inner disk. The sender begins the message by randomly placing the index letter against any other letter on the outer wheel. This becomes the first capital letter of the enciphered message. He continues sending his message by reading from the inner disk to the outer. After writing 3 or 4 words, the sender moves the index letter a random number of places. He signifies this move to the receiver by a capital letter. This ensures each segment of the message is separately encrypted. Though the code is virtually unbreakable, the disk itself is slow to operate. Alberti's device doesn't become widely used. It's a future president, Thomas Jefferson, who in the 1790s develops the disk into a prototype machine.
Thomas Jefferson was the man who invented one of the most brilliant and clever cipher systems. They saw kind of locks which were like the attaché case locks, in which you line up 3 numbers together and are able to open the attaché case. And he realized that if you replace the numbers with letters, you would have kind of a cipher system. And the way it worked was as follows. You created 24 disks. On the circumference of each, you had a mixed alphabet, a jumbled alphabet. Each of the disks was numbered. You and your correspondent assembled the disks in the same order, both of you, on this spindle. Then to encipher a message, you put all the letters of your message on a single line. Attack at dawn tomorrow. Locked the discs together so they couldn't move, turned the entire contraption, and picked out any other line as your cipher text. You sent that to the other person. The other person, with the discs assembled in the same order as you, line up all the letters of your cipher message on a single line, and then turn the entire contraption around until he sees the single line which makes sense in English. That will be the plain text message.
By the 20th century, Jefferson's machine is still in use by the U.S. military. But the Germans are developing a machine that's about to overshadow Jefferson's wheel. In post-World War I Europe, secrecy between paranoid nations becomes paramount. The growth of international commerce creates a need for companies to keep their information secret from competitors. Germany's Arthur Scherbius develops the Enigma machine as a means of keeping those business transactions secure. It works by generating an electric current when a letter key is pressed. A number of moving mechanical parts then scramble the path of the current, producing a different letter each time the key is pressed. The Enigma machine is about to become the German Army's most powerful code-making weapon in World War II. A weapon they're confident can keep their secret military codes secret.
Arthur Scherbius had invented a machine which, if you gave the machine to the enemy, even if you gave the machine to the enemy, there would be so many complications, so many possibilities that you could not, in reasonable time, decipher the message.
Just like Alberti's code wheel, the Enigma machine creates multiple polyalphabetic substitution ciphers. It's fast, it's mechanized, and it produces codes that seem unbreakable.
It's a device for turning readable messages into unreadable messages. Given an Enigma machine with an unknown set of wheels, the enemy has to consider that that machine can be set up in 186 million ways.
The millions of permutations are achieved by the number of variables involved when setting up the machine. At the height of the war, German operators changed these settings every day. They placed the rotors in a specified order from left to right. The rings that allow the rotors to turn are repositioned daily, as is the patch panel of cables electrically linking one letter to another. These variables make the Enigma encryption virtually immune to frequency analysis. The Germans think their Enigma code uncrackable. They believe no one has enough time or the mathematical ability to work through the millions of combinations. A coded message is created by typing the German plain text into the machine and then having the encrypted message transmitted via Morse code. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, Nazi-coded messages flood the radio airwaves. At the same time, British military intelligence is in the process of setting up the most secret place in wartime Britain, a place it hopes can crack the Enigma code. Bletchley Park, 50 miles north of London, becomes known as Station X. It's staffed by a hand-picked team of mathematicians and graduate scholars, including Alan Turing, one of the founding fathers of modern computing. Turing and his team are under extreme pressure to come up with some way, either mathematical or mechanical, to crack the Enigma code. By 1940, fleets of German U-boats are sinking thousands of tons of Allied supply ships in the North Atlantic. The U-boats are receiving their orders by Enigma-coded radio messages.
The U-boats in the North Atlantic were in constant coded communication with Germany, saying where these convoys were and arranging for groups of U-boats to come together to attack them. And all of those messages were encoded using Enigma machines. So cracking Enigma was the key to finding the U-boats and protecting the convoys.
Turing begins by exploiting the mathematical and human weaknesses of Enigma. Because the machine cannot encrypt a letter as itself, Turing eliminates thousands of letter permutations. Combine this inherent flaw with the fact that lazy or tired operators sometimes forget to change their personal settings each day, and this lowers the odds further. But it's the daily weather forecast that gives the British their first major breakthrough. Every day, the Atlantic weather is broadcast from the U-boats, and every day it follows the same format: wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and temperature. Seeing the same message layout each day gives Turing the idea of using what he calls cribs, educated guesses to what at least part of the message might say. This is a crib in German of a weather forecast from the Bay of Biscay region. The received encrypted message is placed against the German plain text. If any letters match up with themselves, S's as S's, V's as V's, then the crib is wrong, as Enigma can't encrypt any letter as itself. So they slide the message along until they find no matches. The British now have clues as to what might be in the messages, but it's still too many man-hours to work through all of the permutations and decipher the many thousands of daily intercepts. So they develop a machine of their own to rival the Enigma, a device that attempts to reverse the encryption process of an Enigma machine, known as the bomb. It operates like a search engine, number-crunching possible solutions to fragments of encrypted text. But can the Bletchley bomb crack the Enigma code before the German Navy wins the War of the Atlantic? The British code breakers of Bletchley Park now have a weapon to defeat the Nazi Enigma machine, the bomb. It's not designed to break coded messages, but to crunch through the millions of letter permutations contained in the so-called cribs, the clues obtained by the repeated use of weather reports, greetings, and test signals sent by the Nazis. The operator sets each drum into position according to the enciphered crib text they're testing. As the machine operates, it generates intermittent electrical circuits that run through every possible Enigma setting. The goal is to find an open circuit, which means the bomb has found a setting that converts all of the cipher characters into plain text without any errors. It's a hugely complicated device with nearly 12 miles of wiring and 97,000 carefully machined parts. This bomb has been reconstructed from plans and drawings over the past 16 years. Back in 1943, Gene Valentine was one of the bomb operators at Bletchley Park, working under the strictest security.
Here in Bletchley, we had 5 bombs, and there were 2 people to each bomb, so there were 10 of us on a watch. And apart from them, you did not talk to anybody about your job. The minute you walked out of the bomb room, got in a vehicle to go back to wherever you lived, you didn't think or talk about it at all.
Bletchley Park is one of the best examples of complete security in history. The Nazis had no idea the British were decoding their messages. They also had no idea that their code books and Enigma machines are being retrieved from captured U-boats. Turing and his team are working around the clock, cracking Enigma messages from U-boat positions to the location of reinforcements and feeding this information to the Allies. By 1945, there are over 300 bombs in operation on both sides of the Atlantic, the days of the Nazi Enigma are numbered. The cracking of Enigma and the intercepting and decoding of Nazi messages shapes the outcome of many campaigns and battles of World War II, including D-Day, Alamein, and Anzio. But it's perhaps the vital role of decoding the U-boat messages in the North Atlantic that saves the most lives. Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously states that the Bletchley Park codebreakers were the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled.
The war wasn't won by the codebreakers. The war was won by boots on the ground. Without it, the war would not have been lost. But on the other hand, with it, it was certainly shortened by a significant amount.
After the Second World War, mathematicians like Alan Turing go on to become pioneers of early computing. They don't know it, but their inventions are about to help move the secret science of cryptology out of the shadowy world of espionage and into everyday life.
Our lives leave so many electronic traces on everything that we do. Every purchase you make with a credit card is stored in a database somewhere. Every visit to a doctor, every telephone call, every email, everything that you send or communicate to the outside world is recorded or will be in the near future.
21st century cryptology is based on advanced mathematics and the ability of modern computers to perform calculations and process information quickly.
I think that computers have had a dramatic impact on code breaking. In fact, it was the necessity of trying to decipher World War II messages that really brought the computer industry to bear and was very much responsible for its development. It also changed the nature of, I think, code making and breaking in the sense that with the advent of computers, it's more of a mathematical issue now of this is a hard math problem to solve, and therefore you need to solve this problem in order to break the code.
Yet the language used by a computer to process information is one of the most basic codes ever devised: binary. A computer is a group of transistors that have only two states when electricity passes through them: on or off, which equals in digital terms 1 or 0. It's not just a computer's ability to process data quickly, but how it encrypts the data. In the past, code makers have always needed a code-cracking key shared between the sender and receiver. And as we've seen, this key is vulnerable to interception. But modern computer encryption has removed the need for a shared key. Instead, everyone who uses a computer to send secure information has two keys: a private key and a public key.
Essentially, you have a private key that only you know, and a public key that you can put on your web page, if you like. And people can then use your public key to encode a message that only you can read with your private key, because your private key and your public key are mathematically related.
The mathematics involved are staggering. The Enigma machine had over 180 million permutations of combinations. But public key cryptography deals with much bigger numbers than that. Their encryption system is based on prime numbers, numbers that are only divisible by themselves and 1. Your private key is two randomly selected large prime numbers. Your public key, the product of those two prime numbers. So when you send a secure message, your computer encrypts it using the product prime number and decrypts an incoming message with the two prime numbers themselves. This works because no mathematical formula has been discovered that can quickly factor two prime numbers from one large one. It's estimated that cracking a modern encrypted computer message using state-of-the-art hardware would take over 13 billion years, about the same age as the universe. But public key encryption isn't just a way of transmitting data securely. You can also use it to verify those in cyberspace and to check that no one's tampering with your data. If Mary Queen of Scots had used public key encryption, then she would have known that Walsingham had been reading her messages. And And the outcome of both world wars might have been different if the Germans had realized their secret messages weren't as secret as they thought. For the moment, the long battle of cat versus mouse, code makers versus code breakers, appears to have been won by the code makers. But codes are only as secure as the people who make and use them. Sometime soon, a human-computer programmer will make a typical human error and create the need for someone or something to invent the next generation of codes. And the cat will start chasing the mouse all over again.